this is my first podcast North Carolina style. We're down in Pinehurst, and I am so privileged to be here with Linda Carrier and my daughter Ella to talk about diabetes and marathons. And Linda, I first heard about this woman that ran 7 marathons in 7 continents in 7 days. And oh, by the way, she's diabetic. And your husband sent me so much stuff, and as I started to read a little bit about you, you're kind of even more than that, right? There's more stuff to you, and you're such a wonderful woman as I've been reading. Tell me about the journey. How did you start getting into marathons?
So I come from a large family. So I've got 6 brothers and sisters. I'm the second oldest out of these children. There were 5 of us within 5 years, and then the 2 were kind of, I like to call them accidents that happened, but they weren't. But anyway, so I was always very energetic, and so I was never diagnosed with ADHD, but I probably have that. But I would be, I'd be popping all around the house, and I couldn't sit and just read or, build things or draw like a lot of my other, puzzles, any of that kind of stuff. I'd be running around and it'd drive my mom nuts. So as a young kid, I was probably 5 or 6, she would look at me when she had enough and would say, run around the block until you can't breathe, right? And so I was like, oh, all right. And so off I go. And so I would run around the block, and the neighbor kids all would see me running, and they're like, oh, this is fun. So they put out lawn chairs and see, next time you come around, jump over the lawn chair, So they would do these different things, and they're like, I'm going to time you now, it's a time around. And then when I got tired, I was like, Mom, can I stop? And she's like, nope, you're still breathing. I'm like, okay. So I just had been running since I was a kid. And then I realized that it did actually calm me down, right? So I could concentrate better in school. I could, I wasn't so irritated. I wasn't moving all around, I'm sitting at dinner. And so I could see the benefits as I was getting a little bit older of doing these runs. And so I never really got into running in high school, or because I was just always really busy. But it wasn't until, gosh, in the 90s, I guess, I was working in Seattle, and I was with a couple friends, and they were running, and they said, hey, you want to join? Yes, I do. And because I didn't know all the different routes and stuff, so I'd usually run around my house, and we started running, and then one day we're like, let's try a half. Let's do a half marathon. I'm like, all right. And but I, as a diabetic, I never actually told anybody when I was growing up, mainly because I didn't want to be treated differently. I didn't want people looking at me and going, should you actually have that potato chip? Because I saw that with because I have an older sister who's a type 1 diabetic, Kelly. And then a couple of years after I got diagnosed, one of my brothers was also a diabetic. So there's 3 of us out of 7 who are type 1 diabetics. And but I watched her, because it was probably about 7 years between when she got diagnosed and I did. I would see how people treated her. So I thought, I don't want that. So I just didn't tell anybody. So here I am starting with this running friends, right? And they didn't know I was a diabetic. So I'd always carry like a Snickers bar or something in my bra or my pants or somewhere, right? Just in case. I'm sure I never had to take it out, but I thought that'd be really weird at 6 o'clock in the morning to be like, excuse me, I'll eat this Snickers bar. But so thank God that never happened. But we ran a half marathon, and when I was done, my husband looked at me and said, you think you could do that again? I'm like, yeah. I'm not even tired. I'm going to run back to the hotel. I'll meet you there. He's like, okay. And I had just run 13 miles, right? He's like, what is wrong with you? And so off I go, and I met him at the hotel. And so it was after that I just really thought, I wonder what it would take to run a marathon. I'm like, let me try that, And then I like to challenge myself. So, and I don't like to do anything that's really easy. So it went from there. It got worse.
So, that's 25 years ago, 30 years ago now, right?
Yeah.
My first marathon I ran in 2002. I was in medical school, and my dad had just passed away, and for me, I think it started with geez, I'm getting a little out of shape. Let me figure out something to get back in shape. And my first marathon was the Buffalo Marathon. And within a few steps of that marathon, you know, the guy in front of me had written on the back of his shirt in marker, "This is for you, Dad."
Wow.
And here I am. I had lost my dad a year ago, and now I have 26.2 miles to run with kind of those thoughts in my head. And running has totally become an escape for me from really that moment on. How do you transition into the marathon training aspect of this? You know, you go from, okay, I'm just going to go run, and now it's a half, and you kind of have to train a little bit for a marathon.
Yeah.
And tell me about that.
You do. Again, coming from a large family, it was nice to be out on my own, you know, in my quiet space, you know, and doing some training. But I think running, and I think marathoning, any kind of running like that is really a mind game, right? It's your body. You can train your body to do anything. And so for me, I like just getting out. I like to usually think about something that's going on in the world or in work, right? So I would solve a lot of my work issues in my head while I'm running for 3 hours. And so it could be, you know, I was managing about 200 people the last couple of years of my life, or my work life. And, you know, you have all kinds of things with budgeting and staff and, you know, all those types of issues. And so I would usually pick one or two before I started and then try and figure out, like, what's the best way to solve that? And I would just work through, you know, and even, you know, I could be angry at somebody and I'd work through what I'd say to them. And then by the time I'm done with the run, I'm like, oh, I don't even need to talk to them. I've already talked to them in my head, you know. But it's usually, you know, I just work through a lot of that kind of stuff. And then it makes the run go by so fast. Right? You probably did it too, where all of a sudden you're like running along and you're angry that, you know, something's going on. And then you're like, oh, okay. And then you realize, oh, I'm already done in those 3.5 hours. Oh, you know, it just makes it go by so much faster.
It's certainly a wonderful thing. Ella, I know, tell me about your running experience. I know you can be a little angry runner at times.
Yes. So my first marathon was my senior year of high school. And so at that point I had already decided where I was going to college and that I was going to play soccer. And we have this haunting fitness test for soccer called the VO2. And you hear all about it, even as a commit, how terrible it is. And it's essentially 1,000 meters in under 4 minutes. And then you get a 3-minute rest and you have to do it 4 times. So as a commit who's hasn't even heard about school or anything else about college, and I hear about this daunting thing, and I remember telling my dad oh my God, how am I gonna do that? There's no way. And he was like, well, let's do a marathon. And I was like, what do you mean let's do a marathon? And he was saying you're about to go into this challenging, you're leaving home, you're leaving your friends, all this stuff, and if you can run 26.2 miles, what can't you do?
Yeah.
And so we started training, and for me it was very much so a mental escape too. And I got to spend 7 hours running with my dad sometimes, or however long it felt like. And it's just an escape, and like you said, you're just alone with your thoughts, and it really did teach me how to push myself. My freshman year going in, you're there, you're not home anymore, you're meeting all these new people, and then your second day there, you have to go run the VO2. So I was so nervous. Oh my God, it was terrible. And so you get on the line, whatever. I passed the first one, I passed the second one, and then the third one is for me the hardest. It's tough. And so I had 100 meters left, and someone screamed that we had 15 seconds or something. And I was like, oh my God, there's no way. And I remember closing my eyes, and I was like, this is nowhere near mile 26.2, this is 1,000 or 100 meters. I can do this. And so I closed my eyes and I just ran as fast as I could. And I remember crossing the line, I peed my pants and I passed out. And I didn't even have to run the fourth one. But running that, running a marathon is it really is a transformative, especially your first one. And I was only 17 years old, but you learn so much about yourself. Just you can push yourself so much further than you think.
Thought,
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. Talking about pushing yourself, I think I read in your book there was a slap tear that someone may have wanted to operate on, and you told them, no thank you, I'm going to go run the New York City Marathon first, and then you can operate on me after the New York City Marathon. And then, oh, by the way, I think I'm going to play Bethpage Black.
Right.
Is that,
Yes,
is that an
true.
accurate statement?
That
Tell
is
me a
true.
little bit about that.
That is true. So, and I'm not sure what caused that slap tear, but it's that shoulder. And all of a sudden, it was like I couldn't throw anything, because it was probably from a lot of softball playing. But I had this god-awful pain in my shoulder, and I was trying all kinds of different things. And then they basically said it was a slap tear. And when the surgeon told me, you really need to have this fixed, and we'd like to schedule it for next week. I'm like, oh. No, I'm training for the New York Marathon, and so yeah, that isn't going to happen. And so he's like, well, I'm just going to tell you that it's going to be really painful when you're running. I'm like, I could deal with that, kind of what you're talking about, right? It's like you can get through that. And so I thought, is it going to kill me? And I don't need my shoulders really to run. I just need to make sure my legs are working, right? And so I did that, and then of course anywhere that we go for a marathon, my husband and I, we usually try to play golf. And so we're always playing, so either we're playing golf before I run, or it's after, or sometimes it's before and after. And so that's, and I thought, because the surgeon told me, he said, you're gonna be out for 6 to 9 months, doing any, playing golf or any of that kind of stuff. So I was like, well, I can still run, right? I'm always asked that. Anytime I have something wrong with me, I can still run, right? Okay, it's gonna be painful, that's fine.
Surgery eventually happened and
Yeah,
went well.
it did,
and
all
maybe
went
no
well.
big deal,
Everything was
but
good, yeah.
The world didn't fall apart.
Yeah, my arm didn't fall off, it was good.
Tell me about Kelly.
So my sister Kelly, she was the oldest of our family, and she was, when she was born, she was really tiny. She was like 5 pounds, 5'7" maybe, because my mom smoked, and so she was born really tiny, and then because she was so tiny, my mom overfed her, and so she was like 35 pounds when she was just like a year old, turning a year. So she was a little slow in walking. It was probably because she couldn't lift herself up. We always joked about that, but she was the cutest little kid. But then I came a year later, and I was also tiny, but my mom knew better than to feed her as much, or feed me as much. But I'd always been really close. There's 3 of us girls, so it's Kelly, Linda, me, and Susie, and then I had my 2 brothers. So the boys were like, they're boys. And so the 3 girls always stuck really close together. And so when Kelly was 8 and I was 7, she started losing a lot of weight. And she was always eating, and was always thirsty. And we thought that was weird. And she, and she started getting really lethargic too. And so she was struggling in school, and she's a grade ahead of me. But I remember as a kid that Kelly the weight was just dropping off of her. So I would get home, and my mom would stand me next to her, and we'd get on a scale. She'd weigh Kelly, and she'd weigh me. And when Kelly got below, because I'd always been like this tiny little skinny thing, and when Kelly started weighing less than I did, right? My mom was taking her to the doctor like once a week, could not figure it out. They thought it was some kind of virus. They were testing her all kinds of stuff, but they didn't know what was wrong with her. So we go to school. I go to school, my sisters and brothers, but Kelly went to the doctor, and before we got home, our neighbor lady was reading through the Reader's Digest and had seen this thing called the sugar diabetes, and she said, Loretta, Kelly's showing these signs that's on this Reader's Digest article. Get her tested for the sugar disease, the sugar diabetes. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm taking her in a half an hour. So off she goes. The doctor didn't want to test her because he says there's no way she has that. And my mom was like, test her, and stuck her right in the hospital. And the people at the hospital said that Kelly was hours away from being in a coma. She was that bad, and so here's, our first indication, our first, we're being thrust into this whole disease, diabetes, what is it? And it was just such I think a traumatic thing for her, right? And because she always kind of felt like she was a little different because she was heavier, right? We're all the whole family's been kind of tall, thin people. And so she was always a little bit more round. And then she gets, to be a diabetic, and she was definitely afraid of needles too. So back then, to check your sugar levels, you have to pee in a little cup, and you take an eyedropper and a little test tube thing, and a little, like a tablet. You stick it in there, and it turns a different color, and then you compare that color to the back of this where the pills are in, and it was like a wide range, right? It would be like 80 to 300, 310 to 500, so it's like, so you really never knew what your blood sugars were. You knew if it was dangerous, but...
And to help a little bit with that, all of this from a medicine perspective is so amazing because we didn't know what it was back then. To think that we couldn't diagnose diabetes in an 8-year-old makes absolutely no sense to me, and it was so true. And now I can tell you if your sugar is 130 or 140, but back when you started, it was 80 or 300.
Right.
What a range, right?
It's a huge range.
Unbelievably medically different now than it was then.
Yeah, and I'm thankful for that.
Yeah.
It's amazing. But even back then, you're giving insulin shots, right? So I was old enough to go visit her in the hospital. So because
Old enough being 7.
7, yes, I was old enough. Yes, I was 7, and I was past the, I think you had to be over like 6 or something. So I was the only one that could go visit her, but they kept her back a year because she'd struggled that whole year. She couldn't think right. When your blood sugar's that high, she was just so sick, and so they kept her back a year. So then Kelly and I were 2nd grade on. We're in the exact same grade, right? But they also used me to be her kind of like her caretaker. So I would watch. I knew I had to learn all about sugar diabetes. Had to learn how to give. Even before she got out of the hospital, I was with her giving, testing, doing injections in oranges, right? And so I'm doing, this is what it feels like to give an injection, and you're poking an orange. I thought this is the weirdest thing ever, but it was kind of fun, as long as it wasn't a human. And then. So I had to know enough about it, so when her blood sugars would drop during school, I would know what to do, and I knew what signs to look for, because you didn't have the CGMs that you have today. You don't have little blood sugar checkers with your finger, and so I'd be sitting in class, and I would know to look to see if she turned really pale, or if she was sweating, or if she was just very lethargic or slow in responding. So I was constantly looking over at her, what are you doing over there, right? You look pale. Eat a candy bar. So, so that's just how we did it, because even the school nurses didn't know anything about it, right? So I grew up with her and kind of trying to watch and make sure that she was okay and surviving, through that. And so it was interesting. And so of course when I started showing signs at the age of 14, because I don't really drink a lot of water, but all of a sudden I was like, I am so thirsty. So I was stopping at every water fountain, and I'm like, no, So I remember going home and saying, okay, I gotta pee in a cup and doing, the thing all over again. And sure enough, I was in the hospital that night.
So now you're diabetic.
Yep.
And we start running. How'd that make you feel when you wanted to run? What did doctors tell you?
So the doctors and my parents, they basically told me that they didn't want me doing, all my sports were going to stop. I played softball, I was in tetherball, I was doing all kinds of different, even after school stuff, right, for running and that kind of thing, that they didn't want me to do any of that because they were afraid that blood sugars would drop, and they didn't know, they didn't want that, right? They didn't want that risk, and so I wasn't having any of that. Granted, I was 14, so, but I was like, what? No. And so I convinced my parents that, as long as is I'm safe, right? I do everything to prepare for the worst. You know, it should be fine, right? I promised them, I'm like, I promise you it'll be fine. But my mom was very adamant. I want you to sit down, you just start reading your books like your sister Kelly. No, you know, I'm like, I can't do that, right? So I just kind of ignored it, and you know, and made sure that I was always, you know, always had something with me. And so very rarely do I go anywhere where I don't have something in my purse to be able to handle if there's ever an emergency. So.
How do you transition from training for one marathon to training for 7 marathons in 7 days?
Yeah, so that, because you know, you can look up any kind of, you know, schedule for a regular marathon, right? There's all kinds of different books and stuff out there. I didn't know how I was going to do this 7 marathons, you know, in 7 days. So social media, right? So I started looking and trying to find somebody who's like a coach that's done something similar or has trained somebody like in maybe an ultra, to ask them mainly about like, how do I do this, right? So I found a coach out in Portland, Oregon. And the other thing about me too is I don't like to be micromanaged. I don't want people kind of
never guessed
yeah,
that.
you
Linda, I've known
guessed
you
that.
7 minutes, and I would never have guessed that.
Yeah, so I had these coaches that were all like, I'm going to call you every day, I'm going to have a thing, and I'm going to check with you, you know, and I'm like, no, just give me a schedule, and I will check in with you once a month, right? And just like, you just kind of watch, and then if you see something, you tell me what I need to do. So I found this lady out of Portland, Oregon, and she was wonderful. So she set up, but she knew enough about me that she'd only do it like a week at a time for my schedule thing, right? So, because I'm like, can you just give it to me for the whole time? No. So anyway, so it was fine. So I started following her schedule, and you basically, I had to retire. I was still working full time, and I was traveling every other week back to Portland, Oregon, because we had moved out here to North Carolina. So every other week, I'm 1 week here, 1 week in Portland, 1 week here, which was a little tough because I was doing like red eyes, you know, back because I couldn't miss any of the days work. So, but then to train, you have to run a lot of hours, and so to do that, I couldn't really work the kind of job I was working. So I was in IT, and I was running the infrastructure and operations, so it was kind of a 24/7. So any of our thousands of systems hiccup, you're on a call, right? It's, you know, just making sure that things are up and running, and you're, you know, letting all the executives and every leadership know in case they had to keep people at home or bring them in, whatever. So it's not just a typical 8 to 5 job, and so I needed time to be able to run uninterrupted and get this thing done. So I ended up retiring. Of course, my CEO thought he's like, most people retire to sit on a rocking chair, you know, maybe play a little bit of golf, but you're going to retire to go run the World Marathon Challenge. I said, yes. And so, which he thought was just bizarre. But, so anyway, so I had to retire, and then this running, basically the running schedule would, especially in the heaviest part of the running, I'd have like days where I'd run 20 miles in the morning, I'd wait 4 hours to run another 10, or I would do 10 plus 12, or I could do a 24 mile on one day and a 20 mile the next day. And I was running on average about 6 days a week. And then it got to a point where she would say, okay, this is the time, Linda, where you don't play golf too. So can you just try and stay off your feet? I'm like, oh, okay, what if I take a cart? Can I still play if I take a golf cart? You know, just like, oh, God. But so I worked through that kind of stuff. But I think I was running, I think my longest week, a couple of them were about 125, 126 miles a week. And so that's a lot of time, you know, to get that stuff done. And when you're split them between morning and afternoon, you know, you don't really have a whole lot to do with work or anything else.
Ella, what do you remember about your training? You know, when we trained, where was your time? How many? I don't even really remember. You trained better than I did. But how
Yeah,
did
I
you
think-
balance like high school and training for a marathon?
Yeah, it was hard. Definitely like a lot of like mornings or like afternoons after school and so we started over the summer, so that was easier, you know, like we didn't have school, we didn't have that kind of stuff, but towards the end of our training was like prime soccer season, and so it would be like, you know, you have a game Friday night, you take Saturday off, and then, you know, you go do your long runs on Sundays. It was definitely hard, but I think for me, like a lot of the motivation was like, okay, like I'm doing it with my dad, and so like, where did you find your motivation for, you know, like after one marathon, I was like, okay, yeah, no, I'm good. Like, how did you like keep going for, you know, not one more day, not like 7 more days? That's insane.
Yeah, and it's usually when I set a goal,
Mhm.
once I get to that point where I'm like, I'm gonna do this,
Mhm.
and my husband knows this too. It's like, because I've told him, I'm like, I will finish this, even if I have to crawl across the finish line.
Yeah.
Right? And I've always told him too, if I ever die during a marathon, can you just drag me across and then bury me with the medal, just to make sure I can cross the finish line?
So-
But
I'm gonna interrupt for just a second because I read a story about your first ultra, and you're a diabetic who
yes,
didn't have any insulin, and your insulin pump broke.
yes.
And as a doctor, you thought it would be a great idea to run, and you are very similar to me in that I think when you run, you're probably just running. I'm going,
Right.
and this was in the woods, and you had to know where you were going.
Right.
If I was Eric, I would have vetoed that. How did he let you run this thing without
was
insulin
sleeping.
and you about died, right?
Well, I had to be there. The race started at 4:30 in the morning, so he was sleeping.
Yeah.
So when I get up in the morning, that's when my pump wasn't working. I was trying to do something, I'm like, oh my gosh. And I thought, maybe, because it was the first time I'd ever failed on me, so I thought, it's probably okay. So I called Medtronic, and I'm like, okay, this pump, this is what it's doing. And they're like, we're gonna have to overnight one to you. Okay, but I'm running a 50-miler in like 2 hours. She's like, I suggest you not do that. I'm like, okay, thanks. So I hung up, right? And I thought, what am I gonna do, right? So I just quickly, without, because I may have been on a pump for a while, so I totally forgot like how the measurements and how you're supposed to do whatever. So all I had, because it was no pump, all I had was the fast acting. I didn't have any long acting. I totally forgot about that part of it. So I grab my insulin bottle, I grab a couple syringes, because I always have those in my, if they don't look bad, so I just had them in my drawer. Grab a couple of those, and I grabbed a bag, because I thought, I'm going to need this, and then like sugar, right? And I just stuck it in the bag, and I just ran out the door. But I wrote a note, honey, my pump, because I put my pump right there, my pump broke this morning, and they're going to overnight it. I'll see you in about 12 hours, right? Bye. Love you. And off I go, right? And all of a sudden I get this phone call, like, and he got up and was like, cannot be serious. But you were running this ultra. And I was like, oh, I've already trained for it. I got this goal. So, again, that whole goal when I set it, I'm going to drag myself across the finish line. But yeah, so you're up in it, because it's a 50-miler, you're up in the mountains, and I am directionally challenged. So it's and then it rained that night before, so where they had marked arrows, it had washed away. So they put tiny little pink ribbons on branches where you're supposed to turn. Who sees that? Right? I was like, so I was really worried about trying to find, where I had to turn, because there's only 25 of us running it, so you didn't have like a group of people to follow. But yeah, so not only did I not have my insulin, my pump working, but I thought I was pretty good with that, having that insulin in my bag. But then, because I chose a tiny little black bag, they put them in a van and drive it up to this bag drop. So I get up there like mile 30 or something, and I'm like, okay, now I can check my blood sugar and give insulin if I need it. But I'm thinking, I'm running, it's probably fine. So I was running, but I couldn't drink it. I wasn't drinking anything. I wasn't eating anything because I didn't have any insulin on me. So I go 30 miles without anything, and I get up there, and I'm like, okay, and they line all the bags up on the trail. My bag's not there. And so I thought, what the heck, right? Where's my bag? So I'm picking up everybody's bag. I'm like, and so I looked at this lady. She's like, what's wrong? I go, where's my bag? And she's like, it should be there. And they're all looking for it. I'm like, nope. I'm like, okay, well, now we had to go up 5 miles and come back 5 miles and then finish the next 10. So I said, all right, well, I'm going to go up. And then you need to find this by the time I'm coming back. So I got 10 miles, right? You have to find this by the time I get back. I'm okay, so I'm like calling everybody. And I go running up. By this time, I'm really not feeling well. And so, like I'm starting to throw up and, because I really, you can't go that long without food and water. Apparently, I learned that one. But,
While running 30 miles.
yeah. But I was like, it was kind of crazy. But I think if I was going to get divorced, this would have been, I would have sent that over the edge. But so anyways, I come back and they found my bag, and what had happened is it slid in the back of the van because it was tiny and black. They never saw it. So when they grabbed everybody else's bag, mine was back then. They found it, so they come riding on a bike. They're like, "We'll be here soon," and so I just kept going. So I'm going to my last 10 miles, and they rode out with a bike, and handed it to me. And my blood sugars were high, and I was throwing up, and I'm trying to drink water, and I'm puking as I go. So my time was not very good, but I finished, and Eric was there at the end, and wanted to kill me.
I'm sure he did, and he was the smart one in the group. He was the smart one in the group. Angela Duckworth wrote a book called Grit, and in her science, she really figures out how to describe this thing that people have that in one word is just grit. Where did you find your grit to finish a 50-miler while you're throwing up on your shoes? Right? Where does that part come from?
I don't know exactly. I think there's something in me that I just, once I set, and that's probably the stubbornness that Eric calls me, but it's like there's just this part of me that I've never given myself an excuse for not doing something. Which could be very easy to do as a diabetic, and that I think part of that comes from that, right? That I don't want to have an excuse to not do something, and so it could very easily have been like, gosh, my pump broke, and I'd really like to run that, but I can't because I'm a diabetic and I could die, But I'm like, and that's true, I could, but I thought, okay, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that I can finish this race and not die. And so I did both of them. Probably not the smartest thing to do, but I did both. And I think it's that. It's the same thing with the World Marathon Challenge. I think once you can have all the excuses in the world. You can have a blister on your toe, and I've seen people that were like, now it's bleeding, now I have to stop. Right? I've never been like that. I just have never, even as a small kid.
Do you think you learned any of that? Do you think some of that was from your parents telling Kelly, you got to sit here and stubborn using, I'm never sitting here and I'm just going to do what I want to do. Is there any learned, or do you think it's just who you are?
I do think it was. I think one of the things my dad used to do with us is, and mainly because there's 7 of us kids, but if we were even like, trying to say that we're not feeling very good, so we don't want to go to school, and he's like, he look at you and go, you're upright, and he says, you don't have a fever, you can go to school, can you walk? Yep. I'm like, all right. So off to school, your nose could be running, you could be coughing up a storm, right? But if you're upright and you don't really have a bad fever, and he's like, go. And then he used to tell us all the time that he had never taken a sick day at work until I was a teenager. He had actually gone through some class, and so he had to have some thing, and he couldn't type anymore. But he was off for a couple of weeks while he healed, and that was the first time he had ever taken any time off from work. And so he was like, my kids are not going to have an excuse of, I know it was a little ruddy, right? There wasn't none of that. It was if you can get up and you can move and you can sit up and watch TV, you can go to school. And so I think that was part of it, right? It's just so I'm like, okay.
Ella, do you feel Mom and I coached you at all with grit, like her parents would have?
Maybe not to the extreme, but I think that is one of like the challenging things for me, is like finding that, you know what I mean? Like, it's such a unique thing to have, I feel like, and over the summer, my soccer coach introduced us to this woman who calls it like the pain cave, and when you get there, it's like you're there and you got to live with it, and like, how do you navigate that? And I think
you have to figure out
Yeah.
how to,
and I think since like being in college and doing a marathon, like you learn to navigate and find that more, and like learn your limits, and then learn like, when is that stopping point? Like when you're like, okay, now I need to rest, I need to,
right.
and I think that's something I struggle with, is finding the like, okay, I need to stop, like
Yeah.
I need to take a day. But
I think probably all three of us have issues with recovery, where we go, okay, let's rest. Linda, as you're doing your stuff, you're running 7 marathons in 7 days. What's rest? When do you turn it off? What do you do? What does your coach tell you to do as you're going through that?
Yeah, so you do need to recover. So there are ways to do that, and ways to I don't know if I'd say I'm actually probably not that good at the resting piece of it. Shocking, I know, but I do need, and when I like go down, meaning like I'm like really tired and I have to sleep for a few hours. I go down hard, but I only go down probably like 4 hours, and then I'm back up. And so I've never been one that could sleep for 12 hours, or sit on a couch on a Sunday and put the feet up. I just have never been like that. And so during the World Marathon Challenge, you did need to. The only time you could really rest was on the plane. So it could be 5 hours between like Cape Town and Antarctica, right? It's a 5.5 hour flight. So you're getting done, and in 5.5 hours, 6 hours, you're running again. So so you're taking that time, and you try to eat, and you're trying to stretch, and you're trying to just like get the feet up, right? Try to get the blood flowing, and so you'll see pictures where our feet are up on the back of the plane seats in front of you. You're apologizing, sorry, my feet don't stink, but you're kind of doing anything you can to try and just rest, and that's it. That's basically where you're resting, is on the plane.
Start in Antarctica.
Yes.
Right. You ran a marathon there.
Yep.
And somehow managed diabetes.
Yep.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so one of the things I was worried about being, if you look at any of the Medtronic, the mini-med pump, it'll tell you like, it's good for, temperatures up to, 80 degrees and down to, 32 or whatever it was, right? I don't know what the exact numbers are. And so I'm thinking, I'm gonna be like in minus temperatures. How's that gonna work? So I had talked to Medtronic about, and you can always get loaner pumps. So I got a loaner pump. My doctor told me, she said, just get a loaner pump, write all your settings down, keep it in the plane. So while you're out running and minus 25 or 40 degrees, that if it were to stop, you at least have a backup. Okay, but great. So, but what I did is I prepped it in a way that when you're running in Antarctica, you have to basically layer. One of the challenges of running in Antarctica is it's real windy, so then the wind chill factors really will get to you, and so you have to run fast enough, right, to finish it. That you can't run too fast where you sweat, because then you get hypothermia, right? So you're trying to make sure that you're kind of running at a pace that's not going to create a lot of heat and sweat. But then I had to make sure that the pump was warm enough. First time I did it, I totally forgot about I was wearing
CGM?
my iPad on my outside of my, because I put all my everything, and then I put my iPhone on my on like an armband, right, with my music, and I started running for like 10 minutes. It was like music stopped, and I looked up, it's too cold.
Yeah.
So it shut down. Crap. Right. So so I learned that, but that's what I was more worried about, my pumps. I totally forgot about my phone. But I put my pump, just to keep it warm, in my layers. So I had it actually sitting in my underwear, in my long johns, and then I had like wind pants over top of that. So it was sitting down in there. So I thought my body should be warm enough, right? And it'll be fine. But then I did worry a little bit if it started alarming. I'd have to reach in and take it out. I was like, oh God, I hope that didn't happen, and it didn't. It was, my blood sugar stayed stable during that, but I was worried a little bit about that. But they also told us that somebody told me before we started that when you're running in Antarctica, to make sure you have a buff, and you know what a buff is, right? Those, and so I had multiple hats on, your gloves, layered of gloves and multiple clothing. And I thought, okay, I can just put this buff over top. And I was like, why a buff? Because I thought it was more around protecting your lungs. And that's true. But what it really was is that when you're running, as you know, you'll keep your mouth a little bit open as you're breathing, or if you're talking to somebody, the sun will reflect off of that ice and burn the roof of your mouth. And so they told us, I said, it'll burn the roof of your mouth, and then it'll blister, and then you can't eat. And you have 6 marathons after that, and you need to eat. It's up there. Right? I was like, yep, that buff is staying right up there. And so I didn't have any problem. But yeah, so it was, there's some things you have to think about as a type 1 diabetic that others didn't. The other thing is I think it was my second, because I've done this World Marathon Challenge 3 times. The second time I did it, the winds were so bad. It was the worst of the 3. It was really pretty horrible conditions. A lot of people, there was a handful of people they went down to the half marathon or 10K instead of finishing the full. But of course I was like, you drag me across the finish line, but frozen maybe, but I'll get across that finish line. But I remember putting my water bottle that had a little bit of electrolytes and stuff in it, and also kept my blood sugars a little higher. In a normally you carry it on my waist, but I thought, well, I'll put it in a warming tent. And it's this tiny little tent, and you could have like a little table in it, have cookies and drinks. So I thought, well, I'll just put my drink in there, right? And so when I come around, I can grab it and drink it every couple miles, and I get in there. It was frozen solid. Yeah. I was like, oh, this is not a good warming tent. I'm trying to trying to get it done, but yeah, so that was a little bit of a challenge.
So walk through the process. You finish there,
yes,
and hop on a plane, and now where are we going?
Yes, so everybody meets in Cape Town first, and you get your bibs, and you get told how this is all going to work. Then you get on a plane, you fly to Antarctica, and you run. It's basically running laps because it's they call it an ultra race, right? So you're running laps because you don't have anybody that can watch all these runners go out 13 miles and come back 13 miles, right? So they get to see you every couple miles as you run around and make sure that you're not injured and everything is good. So you do that. I think we ran like 6 laps or something. And then as soon as the last person's finished, then everybody gets on the plane and they fly you to the next stop. So then we go to Cape Town, back to Cape Town, and you land. They take a bus, you get out to the start line, they put up the little start line, the timing and everything, and then you start again. Now the temperature was on average about 100 degrees difference between Antarctica and Cape Town, and you're 5-6 hours from that, right? That's another thing I was worried about with my pump. It'd be such a huge difference, change in temperature. I thought, oh good Lord, right? But it was fine, it worked perfectly fine. So now we're in like tank tops and shorts, and Cape Town. So we did 5 or 6 laps there. As soon as the last person's finished, you get back on the bus, back to the plane, and then you go to Perth, Australia. And that's really your first real time to kind of rest, because I think it was like 14 hours. And so they had a couple fuel stops there, and that was fine. But you could, you could actually rest and you could eat as you're doing that. And so get to Perth, Australia, you run, and then you get back on the plane, and then you go to Dubai. That, I think I was like an 8-hour flight or something, so you had a little resting time there. And then the first time I did it, it was in, last 2 times it was in Fortaleza, Brazil. The other one was in Santiago, Chile. And that was tough. That was tough because it was at night, and it was through this park, and they had these like cones set up where you'd have to make all these turns and stuff in this park. But then you also had, like the entrances to all the park had multiple entrances into it, and it had like brick or stone walkways. But you'd have dirt, and then you'd have this bricks, walkway, come back off, and then there was a part of it where you have to go over these bridges, these wooden bridges, and you come back around, and then you're on these, and they would drop, and you're trying to run with this headlamp, right? Which was making me a little bit nauseous, right? Because you're running down these things, and you're like, and so I'm like trying to do this headlamp, and was watching, but I'm also trying to watch where I'm going up ahead. And the first lap I was doing, I came around, I was I don't know, a couple hundred yards probably from the first lap, person that counts them as you go. And I didn't see that their lip from the dirt to the stone walkway was about this big, so my toe hit it, and I go flying, right? I thought, good God, right? But I was doing, it was one of those, like, your arms are flailing, and the candies I usually carry were like flown, and I'm just doing everything I can not to do a face plant. And there was this security guard that was sitting in a chair, because it was 2 o'clock in the morning, right? He's sitting there, I guess, and he watches me as I go flying by him. And then I'm like, don't worry about me. Because I stayed up, right? Go back, pick up the things I dropped, right? Back on my way. But I remember thinking, okay, watch where you're going, right? So I'm like, anytime I knew that there was a drop or whatever. But I thought that was probably one of the harder runs to do, just because it was at night, and the terrain was so different, right? And throughout the whole laps that you were doing, and then last person finishes, you get on the bus and a plane, and you fly to Miami, and that's where most people, like their families, all gather, and you're getting off the bus, and this was I think it was at night as well, but it was a lit path, so it was easy. But you're hearing all the cheers as the bus is coming up, and all your families, and it's like, yeah, so it was actually really fun. Yeah.
And then how do you recover after 7 marathons in 7 days? What's the downtime?
Oh, I played golf the next morning. Yes, I did. I know. But Eric made me take a golf cart, because he didn't want me carrying my bags and walking. But normally anytime I finish a marathon, I do like to take a run the next morning, just to get the blood flowing again in your legs, right? Yeah. Because usually the 2 days after the marathon, you'll feel it. You probably do too, right? And you'll feel it. It's usually, because you'd think it would be the next day you'd feel it worse, but it's usually the day after. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's lactic acid or whatever, but I usually like to just keep moving, but I don't want to run. I didn't run another marathon.
As you look back, I think the analogy that I use all the time is we all have different mountains in our life, right? Something that happens along this journey. What was a mountain? What was a bump through any one of these processes that you went through to train for 3 of these things? What was a big setback that was there ever one where you went, oh my God, how am I going to get over this thing? Or did you just Linda it? You were like, I'm fine, I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah, I pretty much Linda it. I'm trying to think if I had anything that was, I don't think so. I can't think if there was anything that actually, came up. I mean, you have to juggle a lot of things, right? But there's nothing that was, insurmountable. I did get sick one time, but I was only sick for a day. But I had like a fever of 103, and and I was like, and I had just run like 24 miles, and I'm like, I'm hungry for some reason, and they're here trying to feed me, and I'm like, could eat, so like, I think I have to lay down, but it was fine the next morning, but I don't know what that was, but I was like, oh no, and I was only 3 weeks away from the start of the the marathons, the World Marathon Challenge, and I was thinking, oh God, what if this, what if I'm sick for a couple weeks, but it was fine.
Talk a little bit about balance. One of the things I read is that, I think it was Tokyo, you did the Tokyo Marathon, and you made damn sure you were back at work 9 o'clock in the morning on Monday morning.
Yes. Tell
me how you balance that.
Yeah, so so for some reason, I try to get, and I don't know if I'm like a yes person, but I try to anything that I've committed to, I try to make sure that I deliver. And so when I got accepted, I didn't think I would get accepted into that Tokyo Marathon, and I did, because apparently it takes like a lot of people, like it's a lottery, right? And for some reason I got accepted that first time, so I really wasn't expecting it. So I'd already had some commitments I had to do with work. And so all of a sudden now I've got this marathon, and I knew that I had to get that done too. And so, so I usually just try to figure out, I give up things for me before I give up anything for anybody else, right? So if I'm gonna do this, I'll give up sleep, I'll give up eating, I'll give up, whatever I'm gonna, you know what I mean? It's like, I'll sacrifice that to make sure that I'm delivering. And so with that Tokyo one, I was like, okay, I can take this Friday off. So I took and I did like a overnight flight, and by the time, because you lose a day, and then I got to Tokyo, I was able to get my bib and run like the next day, and then it was like, okay, well now I'm gonna gain a time back, and I was like, I'll make that 9 o'clock meeting. Like, okay, and I did. I was like, I was like, please, do not be late. And I landed, and I was back at work, and they're like, you were just in Tokyo? Yeah, yesterday. I ran that marathon. And they were like, it's fine, But I even did it with a 50-miler. The next morning I was back at work, and it was.
Ella, as a sophomore in college, some of your balance stuff. Ella was in the national championship game this year in Las Vegas, and had to study for finals on a red eye from Las Vegas back to Geneva. Talk a little bit about that experience for you.
Yeah, it's definitely hard, especially I think one of the reasons I chose Division III and was because I wanted more of that balance. And so when we made it all the way this season, it was an incredible experience. Like, we're in Vegas, we're like playing all these teams. We have like this casino like hotel. It was like surreal, and then we ended up losing in the finals. And so you're dealing with all those emotions. And then you get on a plane 4 hours later at 9 o'clock, and then, you're landing back in New York, and you have a final 6 hours later. And so it was hard to try and navigate that. And you have those moments where you're like, okay, like you said, like, what are you giving up? Is it the sleep? Is it in college, spending time with your friends, coming home to visit family? And it's definitely, as a young person, trying to navigate that is hard. Yeah.
That is tough, and I think sometimes, and you probably saw that too, you have to push your emotions aside as well, right? Because we should all take that time to mourn or feel bad or sad or whatever that might be, and sometimes that'll suck a lot of time up, right? Just because you're just sad and you're But I know I've done that where I'm like, I just gotta push that aside. And you try your best in your head just to push it aside and think, I can do that tomorrow, right? I'll get over, we'll have a drink, or we'll do whatever about, losing that final game, and, but you just have to, sometimes you just have to recognize it, and then push it aside. Sometimes it's so enveloping that you don't, you have to realize it's sucking up time for other things.
Yeah. I think that's hard, especially in my generation. I feel like there's a lot of the poor me kind of attitude, you know what I mean? And it's hard, I failed my first exam in college this semester, and you can only feel bad for yourself, for so long before it's like you said, it sets you back. And so I think there's definitely a learning curve with it, but I think especially with this generation, and you have to be able to find more of the balance and driving forward.
And I think too, you look at every, and I'm going to call it a failure, but sometimes it's just a setback. Sometimes it's not really a failure, but I always look at every mistake, every failure, every whatever that is, as a learning opportunity, right? Life is too easy if everything is perfect, right? And who wants that? I always want to learn. So even if, and as I think with part of my running is I always want to push myself, and I want to say, where is that limit? And I'll do it with work and with running and with golf and whatever it might be. Push, because it's I always want to be learning. Yeah. And so it's, you figure out what happened on that test. Yeah. Right. And what happened with that, right? And then you're like, hey, what did I learn from that? All right, you know?
Yeah.
And you just kind of, and then you change and alter and do what you got to do.
Yeah. One of my dear friends, Lewis, just read a book that talked about kind of looking at life in the terms of like every choice is like a tiny experiment.
Yes.
And you know, like you learn from it and you learn it's good or you learn it's bad, and kind of how you adapt to that throughout your life. And I thought that was such an interesting perspective to kind of look at it as like it really is like a little experiment. And like you said, it's not necessarily like a failure, but like more of like a chance to learn.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
I think some of the stuff that's wrong might be too strong a word, that we're also afraid to be vulnerable.
Yes.
We are also afraid to say, I screwed this up.
Mm-hmm.
I had this hard time. I didn't quite make it. I'm sorry. I'm going to learn and figure out how to do it a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that came from my parents, right, or from your parents, but somewhere in the past that was, that was the coaching. And I don't know, it's probably not right, as we evolve and to be little better versions of ourselves.
Yeah, I think it builds trust with people around you. If you, not in my job, I was a leader, and people think leaders or, certain people, your parents or your grandparents, whoever it might be, they're the people you should follow, and they do everything right. Well, you don't, right? None of us is perfect, right? We're just humans. We're gonna screw up somewhere. Your dad punished you for something that maybe you shouldn't have been punished for, and you're like, But you start to realize that people actually are not perfect, and I think if we all looked at ourselves and just did that, kind of like, I admit, I'll be like, I probably shouldn't have run that 50-mile
Right, you shouldn't have. I know that.
And I'll admit that now, but there are things in my life that I will admit that I shouldn't have done, but this is what I learned from it, right? And I was wrong for doing this, and this is what I learned from it. And as long as you can do that, I think people around you will start to realize, that they can trust you, because you're not gonna stick to just because, they think you're the boss, and it's like, no, I know, I'm the boss, but I'm an idiot sometimes too. So I'm gonna tell you, I made a mistake here, and but every mistake is an opportunity for learning. So, and I do think we're all kind of raised that way, right? We all think, that these people should know everything. You think about your president, you think about your boss, your CEO, your CFO. You think, oh, they're the so knowledgeable one because they've got that job, but it's not always true.
It's oftentimes I think they're the best communicator, they're the best motivator, they're the person that connects with you, so that you go, okay, I am going to run through a wall for you, because this is how you ask the question. If there's a 60-year-old out there, I don't want to mention any ages, but if there's a 60-year-old out there
soon to be 63
that's struggling with stuff, with motivation, with geez, my hormones are off, my this is off, what's your advice to those other peers of yours to say, come on, you guys, you can do this, you can get through it?
Yeah, I think I would say that unless, and this is probably my parents speaking right now, but unless you have a limb falling off, or you're on life-saving machines, there really shouldn't be anything that's going to stop you from doing something. It might not be your perfect performance, so we all, like, obviously I'm through my whole menopause thing, but during menopause I'm running marathons, right? So my hormones are going all over the place, and sometimes you're just dead tired, and your iron's low and whatever, but I'm not dead, right? So I might not run my 4-hour marathon, that might be now a 4:15 or 4:20, but I'm gonna do it, right? So I think you shouldn't stop just because things like that, unless there's an absolute, like, you're gonna die, or you're gonna lose a limb, or whatever that is, right? But and that kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier about I just don't like excuses for not doing things, and it's so easy to be able to say that. It's like, I don't have the time. Well, you did. You could if you maybe only spent an hour for lunch instead of 2 hours, you know, whatever that might be, right? So, but it's all priorities. And so you figure out what's important to you, and then I think, you know, you'll find that
Some of the stuff that I've been looking into talks about the difference between planning and being a planner, and then the principles that are involved with that. And so anyone can make a plan, but somewhere along the line, you have to stick to the principles that you set to yourself to accomplish that plan. And I think that's a big part of where the disconnect is sometimes. Ella, do you find any of that stuff as you're trying to set up your organic chemistry and biochem and neuropsych and soccer and?
I was like, good Lord.
Yeah, it's definitely hard, and I think, like you said, just like picking your priorities, like it's hard. I think especially in college, like, you know, where do those kind of fit? You know, you have spending time with friends and, you know, soccer and school, and it's hard sometimes, I think, to navigate where you want to devote your time for sure.
And I think too with that, so as a former college student, years and years ago, you know, I would see a lot of my friends that would be like, let's meet on, you know, on Monday nights, and then on Wednesday nights, and on Friday nights it's really going to be a party, right?
Yeah.
And Saturdays. And what I would do is I would pick one, right? Because you had so much to do.
Yeah.
And so I'd be like, I'll meet you on Saturday. I can't do the Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but I can do Saturday.
Yeah.
And everybody was fine with that.
Yeah.
But what I think is, especially as young people, you want to be with all your friends. And
Yeah.
your friends want you there, so they're trying to get you. But
Yeah.
you know, as long as your priority is, you know, you want to graduate from college, you want to, you know, you have whatever you're running,
Yeah.
you got your soccer, you got, you know, they'll understand that.
Yeah.
You know, just I think open, you know, conversations and
Yeah.
and still finding time to do it, but maybe
Yeah.
not every day.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I do the same thing. I give my, like, Saturdays my day, like, to spend time with friends, to, you know, do whatever I want to do for myself, and then every other day of the week I'm soccer, running, schoolwork, even, you know, Friday nights, Sundays. I think it's nice to have just that one day where it's
You
like,
have to have it.
Yeah.
Be it recovery, be it, you know, friends, be it whatever that is.
Yeah.
You do need that.
Yeah. I think the piece, honestly, that I struggle with the most is the running piece. Like, I had felt like I had so much more free time in high school to, like, if I just wanted to, like, go for a run or do that. And I think with especially the soccer part, like, trying to factor in that training, and it's different, like, I don't necessarily have the time, or, like, it's not what I'm focused on to go and do, like, a long run. And so it's sad, and I hope to be able to, like, transition more into that. I'm going abroad next spring semester to either Copenhagen or Australia, and so I hope to be able to get more into that as I transition away from kind of playing soccer and can hopefully get back into running again.
Yeah, and that's because running is important to me, not only for my health, but because I enjoy it. I mean, there have been times that I'm like, I get up at, you know, traveling, flying on a plane to Portland, Oregon, I get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, get on a treadmill, and I did it 6 miles in,
Yeah.
shower and up, and I'm back at the airport at 5. You know, so it's the, you know, when I was talking about prioritizing and doing, you know, I give up the sleep,
Yeah.
right, for me to get that run in. But
Yeah.
but it's all about really how important that is, right? And so it's probably not as important as your obviously as your soccer, right?
Yeah.
But and that's okay, right? And just know in the back of your head, eventually, you know, that'll start to go away when you're out of college, and you know, and then that's where your running comes back too. But but even if you just a couple of days got in, you know, it's a different thing. And I remember I was studying for CISP test, and so it's a security test. It's very, very difficult. It's got 10 books of knowledge, and it takes forever to train for this thing.
Yeah.
So I actually had it recorded onto like a book,
Yeah.
you know, and I would listen to it while I was doing my long runs.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about boring, you know, and I'm talking about security and all that stuff, and you know, and I'm like, oh my god, databases, and I was like, and so I'm trying to run through this thing, and then I zone out, and I realize, and I have to go back, you know, to it, and listen on my iPod, right, and I'm like, oh my god. But I actually passed the test by doing that, right?
Oh my God.
But I was able to combine the two. I needed to get the studying done, and I needed to, and I wanted to run, I guess.
Yeah.
But I would say need, but I wanted to run because I was doing a marathon. So I just, I thought, you know, it was painful, but got it done.
Yeah.
So.
My senior year, I did a it's called New Vision Medical, and it's like, so I would spend the first half of the day at my high school and then the second half of the day at the hospital. We would do rotations or classroom stuff, but it was my first time doing like an anatomy class, and so every Monday we would have like a medical terminology test, and so every Sunday for our long runs, we would put stacks of flashcards in our mailbox. And my dad would read me medical terms and give me little tricks to remember. And then every time we would pass the mailbox on a loop, we would put one stack back and get another
one.
And even actually the day we ran the marathon, it must have been like 2 days later or something, I had a medical terminology test. And so for the first 5 miles, we had flashcards, and we were like going through the flashcards, and it was funny. People running by, like, what are you doing? Like, why do you have flashcards? But it's like you said, like you learn to combine the two.
Yeah, it's good. So it depends on how much you want it, but yeah.
And I think most of it is figuring out how can I make this a part of my balance, whatever you're going to define your own balance is. Last question, Linda. We've been talking forever. I would be remiss if I didn't give you a minute to talk about Eric. He sounds like such a wonderful husband.
Yes, he is. And today's his birthday, by the way. But
happy birthday, Eric!
I know. It's like, so we met, he was 20, he was 21, and got married like a year later. But he's a fantastic, he's the oldest of 5 in his family. He's just the light of my life. And we didn't have kids, but he traveled a lot. He worked for Boeing. And so he did a lot of traveling from probably 1994 till about, I think when he retired in 2017, 2016, something like that. But he could be gone like 8 months out of the year. And couldn't come home because he was fixing planes. He did this, anytime there was issues with other aircrafts. But I would normally try to go out and see him on a weekend or whatever, because he was still working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? So it was like, fly out and be like, hey, but he's fantastic, and he's, I think he's my biggest fan. As I watched him when he was sending you stuff, I'm like, oh, good Lord. But he doesn't run. He plays a lot of golf, but he is one that supports me. So I think to be able to do this, I need that support. And when I was thinking about doing the World Marathon Challenge the first time, I kept thinking, God, it's so expensive. I'm like, I don't know about that. And finally he looked at me, and it was 2018, because my first one around was in 2019. He looked at me, he goes, you're not getting any younger. I was like, oh, okay, that's true. So he's like, let's just, just bite the bullet and just go. And so I'm like, all right, but he's just fantastic. I love him to death. We've been married it'll be 42 years this year. So
talking to my new friend Jay as you were coming in, Jay said to me, I know a lot of people around here, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone say anything negative ever about Eric. He is always described as the nicest man ever in the history of all men.
Yeah,
and so it sounds like you agree.
Yeah. He's very helpful. So if you need anything, he'll drop whatever, to be able to help you. And I think that's part of his being the oldest child too, right? That he's always willing to help anybody. But he puts together all kinds of events for others. And if you haven't been to Europe and Scotland and want to go golfing, and he'll put together your whole travel and which courses to play, and he'll call he'll do all that. He loves that stuff, and he loves to help you. And like, how was your trip? So he loves that kind of stuff. So he's right now planning I'm running. I'm trying to. My goal right now is to finish a marathon all 50 states. So I have 4 left, and I'll finish them this year. But here are the ones I'm doing, and so now he's figuring golf around every one of them. And so so we're doing our little golf trips around the marathon. So that'll be fun.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for spending an hour with us. There's so much more we could talk about. Ella, any closing comments or words of wisdom?
I don't think so, no.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much. It was so nice talking to you, and I think you know, as a woman, it's so inspiring to see someone who's done so much and really like let nothing get in the way of it.